Hello, and welcome to episode 54 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Soutra. Before I go ahead and introduce our guest for today, I just wanted to give a warm welcome back to our listeners. I hope you all had a very nice and pleasant holiday season, and I wish you the very best in your endeavors in 2019. All right, so on today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Cailin O'Connor, Associate Professor in the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science at the University of California at Irvine. Cailin is a philosopher of biology and behavioral sciences, philosopher of science, and evolutionary game theorist. Her current research focuses on models of scientific communities. Using formal models of scientific communities, Cailin is answering questions like, how can industry influence the public understanding of science? How do communication structures impact the emergence of scientific consensus? And what can idealized models tell us about complicated scientific communities? Cailin is also using evolutionary modeling to understand issues related to diversity, such as how do discriminatory norms arise between social groups? How does power influence strategic behavior between academics? How do gender and class emerge in societies? Cailin's trade book, The Misinformation Age, co-authored with philosopher of physics James Owen Weatherall, was just published with Yale University Press. Her monograph, The Origins of Unfairness, will be published next spring or summer with Oxford University Press and is available in draft form. One more book of hers, A Survey of Game Theory and Philosophy of Biology, is in its full draft form and available upon request. Cailin is also a sometimes science writer. And when she is not doing philosophy, she is a poultry enthusiast and aerial acrobat. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Cailin. Dr. Cailin O'Connor, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this morning?
Thanks. Oh, thanks, Nick. I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm doing well. The sun is shining here in Bloomington, Indiana, which is a first of maybe the past 2 weeks. So it is. It is so nice. I was just outside walking the dogs, and I am very grateful for today. How about you? How is it out in Irvine? Is it?
It's in Irvine. Yeah, it's shining here. It shines about 350 days of the year, so it's a little less surprising, I guess.
Fantastic. Yeah. How's your holiday season treating you?
Fine. I have 2 6-year-olds.
Oh.
So the holiday season mostly revolves around like post-Christmas play with a lot of Legos.
Nice. Yeah, I see this on your website. You have this really fun photo of you and I imagine your kids playing in a ball pit of some kind.
Yeah, that was in Washington, D.C. We went last summer and there was some pop-up museum thing where they had made this like giant swimming pool out of like a ball pit, basically, like an all-white ball pit.
Nice. Fun.
Yeah.
Cool. So I guess, are you getting psyched and ready for this spring term?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm moving into my heavy teaching quarters, which, I mean, teaching's fine, but it's never my favorite part of the year. So more like girding my loins, I would say.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So how does that work? So you mentioned, do you teach 2 out of the 3 quarters, or kind of what is your sort of setup?
Right. That's how I usually do it. That's how most UC professors do it, I think, is like load their teaching into 2 quarters if they can. So I usually don't teach in the fall and then do 2 in spring and winter and spring.
And what will you be teaching?
Well, so this quarter I'm teaching actually 2 versions of this course that I started called The Philosophy of Sex. So it's a values and science course. Yeah, it's a pretty, well, so the title obviously gets a lot of undergrads to sign up.
Of course.
But it's all values and science stuff, and we go through the kind of sciences of human sexuality, sexual orientation, sex differences between humans, and talk about how gender values have played a role in those different sciences.
Huh. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. Could you maybe share with us, what are maybe like a couple, I don't know, takeaway points you're hoping the students to get over the semester?
Well, I mean, most undergrads I find have a pretty naive view of how social beliefs and biases influence the way people do science. So one of the big goals is just to show them like, oh, well, scientists are humans. And when we're understanding science and scientific results, we need to understand these results in the cultural context in which they're made. And I find just making that point usually like blows their little minds. What? It's not just that you test a hypothesis and then put it in the true or the false bucket. So
some general phil-sci kind of stuff. Yeah.
General phil-sci. Also, we do, the first unit is on gender, and that also tends to just explode a lot of their heads because so few students of that age have ever studied or thought very much about gender. So even just things like how pervasive it is in shaping our day-to-day interactions, or how much of what we believe is kind of inherent about gender is actually different in different cultures, or shaped by some random historical path.
Right.
Just even little things like pink wasn't a girl color until the 1950s or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, they always get very excited about this stuff.
Cool. So this sounds a little bit interdisciplinary, drawing on some like historical, sociological focuses. Yeah, that was kind of my next question is, so here at IU, we have this Kinsey Institute for sex and gender research, and there's a number of different courses. Most of them, though, are categorized as like history of sex, sociology of sex, more like social science-based course. So what does like a philosophy of sex course, how does that maybe differ from maybe another course on sexuality that you might find in a psych department, or that you might find in one of these other humanities-based departments?
Yeah, so I mean, as you notice, the course I'm teaching is very interdisciplinary, and I'm in the logic and philosophy of science department here, so almost every undergrad course I teach is very much immersed in the relevant sciences. But I think the most important things that philosophy brings to this particular course is work on values in science and feminist philosophy of science. So that's a real philosophical contribution, just the way that philosophers of science have contributed to our understanding of social influences on science, social epistemology, this kind of thing. Other philosophers teach very different sorts of courses on philosophy of sex, ethics courses.
Sure.
What is consent, that kind of stuff. And that isn't what I teach.
So you mentioned in kind of some general takeaways in terms of general phil-sci stuff. But maybe the last question on this topic, like what are some general takeaways for what philosophers of science working in the values of science have contributed to philosophy of sex and sexuality?
Yeah, okay. I mean, one of my very favorite points, which I, sort of work at length with the students every year, is something that I usually attribute to Helen Longino. Well, there's a wonderful paper that Longino and Doel wrote where they outline the kind of logic of inference based on evidence. So the point being that, of course, when you have evidence, it doesn't just directly give you a theory or a hypothesis. You have to have all this supporting beliefs to draw an inference from evidence. And that's an old point in philosophy of science, right?
Sure.
But they really apply it to cases where the background context that you use to draw a conclusion from evidence depends a lot on gender beliefs and these social beliefs that are historical, right? And they just show that in some cases, when you're going from evidence to conclusion, there's a pretty small jump, and all the buffering beliefs that you use to make that jump are pretty solid themselves. And then in other cases, it's a really big jump, and all the things that you're depending on to make that inference are much shakier. So, for example, when we're talking about human evolution, often the conclusions or theories that we're drawing, many of them are supported by the same evidence. There's a huge underdetermination problem. And in order to pick any particular theory for how humans evolved, you have to basically make a consistent story that fits with the evidence, but you're drawing on a lot of things like, modern gender values often creep in there, or modern social arrangements creep in there. For example, humans evolved to be monogamous and live in, basically marriage states.
Right.
Well, we all get married now, so it's a little unclear whether that fact is sort of creeping into the theories we make about early humans, for example.
Sure.
Went totally astray. There's an example.
Yeah, no, that's huge. Do you get, so you mentioned some of the students getting blown away by just understanding how science actually works. But are they blown away, or do they argue against some of the things that are brought up in class?
I think usually it's kind of a blown away and also a little bit left adrift. So I'll show them examples of two scientists having a debate over some topic where it's very clear that the social values of both scientists are what's really grounding the debate. Yeah. And yet, of course, using real evidence, the real language of science, doing real experiments, drawing on the best evidence they can draw on to support the arguments they're making. This tends to get the students into this headspace of how do we trust science? Is any of it real? And then I have to draw them back from the brink.
This is what happens. You learn about this, and then you almost just want to throw it all out. But then you're like, wait, no. We don't have to do that, but we do have to understand. Yeah.
Things can be imperfect and yet still tell us things about the world.
Right. Fantastic. Well, thank you for educating us a bit about, and a refresher of what this course is hoping to be like and what it is like. I hope it's a success this spring around.
Oh, thanks.
Well, let's hear a little bit about how you even got interested in philosophy of science, philosophy of sex, and your current research. So let's take a step back and let me ask you, Cailin, where did you grow up?
I grew up in upstate New York in a little town called Manlius, which is outside of Syracuse.
Okay. How big a town?
10,000 people.
Ooh.
Sort of thing.
Okay. What were your parents doing?
So my dad teaches at a small Jesuit university in Syracuse called Le Moyne, and he teaches business psychology, and my mom was a homemaker.
Okay. So as growing up in upstate New York, what were your interests? What were you up to?
So I spent a lot of time reading fiction, a lot of sci-fi and Star Wars.
Nice.
As a youth.
It's just I'm not super familiar with the Star Wars canon, but I know there's a lot of different books and a lot of different. Yeah.
There's a lot of it. And in retrospect, I recognize it as pretty poor science fiction. But, when you're a preteen, you can get pretty excited about that kind of thing.
Sure.
I don't know. I did a lot of performance, so dancing and acting in college or in high school. And of course, was a child.
Yeah.
Spent a lot of time just wandering around, staring at things and whatever kids do.
Cool. What kind of acting did you do? Or just different plays, musicals, stuff like that?
Yeah, I would do community theater, act in musicals, do little plays in school.
Nice.
Just whatever. I actually acted semi-professionally later as a children's theater actress.
Oh, wow.
And put on this like giant red costume, and then I mean it's sort of like as if we were live Muppets, and then do like silly plays for little elementary school kids.
Was this in high school, or was this kind of after?
That was directly post college.
Oh, okay, nice. Oh, that's cool. Still doing any acting now?
No,
it's been a while. Yeah,
maybe if I had some free time.
I know. I'm gonna say, like, as you're developing your tenure, it's kind of hard to do community theater on the side, but it's not unheard of. Folks do music and stuff, and
yeah. I mean, I'm a hobbyist, so I do other things, but that particular one doesn't really fit very well with a full-time job and young kids. You have to do a lot of work all at once to do a play or a musical.
You're right. It's sort of an all-encompassing project.
That's right.
I totally relate. All right. Well, so as you're growing up in upstate New York, how, when and where did you see philosophy coming into your life?
Absolutely not at all. Yeah. So I had a very unusual trajectory into philosophy. I took one philosophy course as an undergraduate, and before that had just no exposure, and didn't actually study philosophy in undergrad either. I didn't really study it until right before I applied to grad school. Really?
Yeah. So maybe you could tell us the story of tell us a little bit about your undergrad story, what you studied, what your trajectory, and how you kind of found your way into then philosophy.
Yeah, sure. So when I went to undergrad, I studied biology for a year and then just really hated pre-meds and the kind of competitive culture in the biology department where I was. And so I ended up getting my degree in filmmaking.
Oh.
Yeah.
Where were you studying?
I was at Harvard.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
Yeah. And so I did this degree in filmmaking and worked then in documentary film and did digital media for a company and did this children's theater acting and, painted some houses and like tap danced on the subway with my friend. And just,
you did the thing where you go into the subway car and you do a little like. Awesome.
Yeah, we would do that sometimes. We never did it in the car. We'd do it like on the platform.
Oh, gotcha.
But so it was just sort of bumming around, and at some point decided that the arts weren't for me because you have to be quite self-promotional to be in film. And so I decided, okay, I'll go back and do my PhD. I had been planning to try to do a PhD in visual studies, but I was really interested in combining my biology interests with visual studies, maybe trying to study what are the neurobiological underpinnings of aesthetic preference? And at some point it became clear that visual studies is not the place to study that. And at the same time, I started dating a philosopher of science, and then I sort of worked my way in. I sat in on some classes in my current department, and then wrote a paper, applied to grad school, got letters, and I'll just go to grad school in philosophy.
But I mean, So I mean, that's a big jump from an arts career. And then trying to kind of, you said you kind of had originally tried to kind of connect those things in sort of the visual and I see your is it BA or A in visual and environmental studies. But yeah, so it sounds like it was just kind of introduced to it. Was there anything particularly gripping about the subject, or?
Well, I mean, what I loved then and still love about philosophy of science is that there's a lot of room to move around and study many different types of things that interest you because it's so thoroughly interdisciplinary and people are completely accepting of really interdisciplinary work. Well, maybe not completely, but
more so. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Much more so. So that was what really got me into it is that, I like the academic freedom of being able to get fascinated by some problem in some science and go down the rabbit hole with it and, start writing on that, even if it's not exactly the thing you had been doing before.
Yeah.
So I think that was what sort of really drew me in.
Okay. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about your graduate school experience then, getting into philosophy of science. Like what were you working on? What kinds of questions were you interested in, et cetera?
Yeah, so I ended up deciding to go to logic and philosophy of science at UC Irvine. That was where I had been hanging around taking classes.
Okay, yes. So you had done, like, you were at Harvard, and then did you transfer to kind of Irvine, California, things like that?
Yeah. So I'm married to the fellow I started dating is Jim Weatherall, who's a philosopher of physics, and he was out here in Irvine in grad school then. So I came out here and then applied and started going to grad school. And I had intended to work on this aesthetic preference stuff, but of course, once I started, just did something completely different.
Right.
More. So my advisors were Kyle Stanford and Brian Skirms. So I got more into philosophy of biology and game theory and evolutionary game theory, and ended up studying that stuff, and then wrote a dissertation on signaling and signaling games.
Tell us a little bit about that. What was sort of the main claims of the dissertation?
So it was a dissertation that's formally unified, but then topically a little more wide-ranging. So I looked at this particular signaling game where you look at communication when people are dealing basically with a structured world where they're encountering objects, states in their world that are related to each other. So today they encounter a small tiger and tomorrow a larger tiger, and there's some kind of structural relation between the things they're communicating about. And so I used this particular model first to write about linguistic vagueness, so why we might evolve to use vague linguistic terms, and in particular, why our typical learning strategies that are very successful would necessitate vague terms. So I wrote about that. I wrote about those learning strategies, which are generalizing learning strategies. So the very simple idea being, if I act in some way in response to a stimuli today, and that works, then I'll try it in response to similar stimuli. And so I wrote a paper asking why might that learning strategy be advantageous. And then a third paper thinking about the evolution of perception and perceptual categories using these signaling models, and why would we evolve the perceptual categories we do, and what that might tell us about whether our categories and the structure of our perception is veridical. Like tracks real world structure in some way.
Right. All right. Yeah. So I know, UCI is very big in the study of evolutionary game, just game theory, evolutionary game theory. How was your dissertation received? What do you think?
I think it was received fine. Actually, the first paper I wrote is by far my most cited paper. I mean, by
really?
Orders of magnitude, like 3 times as much as any paper I've written since. So I think that turned out fine.
Very nice. That's always a plus.
And, it's I love this department. It's very supportive, and my advisors were just always very supportive and helped me a lot in my research, but also liked my research a lot. I mean, they also hired me, so they must have.
Tell us a little bit about your sort of the transition to being. I see in your CV you've done some really cool stuff, doing some postdocs and or visiting fellows, and then So what happened there? How did that come about?
Yeah, so I haven't done a postdoc.
That's right. Yeah. Sorry.
Hired here after finishing my dissertation, and then you might have noticed. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I thought for some reason I saw these visiting positions, and I thought there must have been some time in between, but no. This was right away.
Yeah. No, I just jumped over the fence between grad students and faculty at the same department.
Wow. That's a testament to really good work. I mean, that's really something.
I like it, but And then, I mean, for good reason, decided to try to do a number of visiting positions to get a little more broad philosophical exposure after having, not studied philosophy as an undergrad and then basically just come through one department. I thought, it'll just be better to go learn a sort of broader set of ideas, viewpoints, frameworks for doing philosophy.
Sure. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. So maybe just could you describe a little bit about what it means to do philosophy of science at UCI, and then maybe one or two other places with which you've visited and how those frameworks differ?
Yeah. So the UCI way of doing philosophy of science is something that I like quite a lot. It tends to be very interdisciplinarily focused. There's a big emphasis on, if you're going to do philosophy of X, you better learn something about X. You better actually become an expert in whatever discipline you'd like to write about.
Yeah.
There's a focus on using formal methods, especially mathematical methods. It's not that this kind of school of philosophy thinks that's totally necessary, but that often formal methods are a really useful way to get at deep philosophical problems. There's a real emphasis on carefulness and meticulousness and starting small, I would say.
Okay.
So, for example, we tend to have grad students work on some very small problem first, figure that little thing out, understand that little thing perfectly, and then only later expand to more overarching ideas. And I think the idea is something like, you're not going to come up with a really compelling, large philosophical view unless you've filled in the details in a very careful, thoughtful way. So I'd say those are kind of the main things about the way people do philosophy of science coming out of this department. But there are other things that I think are important. So some other schools like philosophy of science, where part of what you're doing is trying to kick the hornet's nest a bit, just get people thinking about something in a new way. And it can be okay there to write a paper where maybe you haven't worked out every detail, but you're trying to just subvert people's expectations about something. Well, they've always made this assumption. Well, maybe that assumption's not true. So it was good to be exposed to that kind of philosophy. There are many philosophers of science, at Pitt, at Notre Dame, who do this very historically grounded philosophy of science, which is a bit different than what the people at Irvine. Some people, of course, do engage in history of science more, but in other places, the philosophy of science is really feeding off history of science more than current scientific practice. And that creates all sorts of different interesting problems and questions. It's very, I think, important to be exposed to that kind of work as well.
Yeah. I'm trying to think, have you come across a project that feeds off both? Well, I guess this is probably many projects, but I'm trying to think of one that feeds off very strongly the history of science as well as current experimental practice. Because sometimes otherwise you're just doing history. Well, I guess, I don't know, maybe it depends on the questions you're asking. Because oftentimes if you're doing history of science, you're asking historical questions. So where does the current practice come in?
Well, yeah, I think often people use history of science to understand modern science or what we should expect about modern science better. I mean, the first thing that popped into my head because it came up earlier is, for example, work on underdetermination of theories. You would never be able to understand underdetermination without looking at the history of science, because you need to understand what happened in past episodes from a perspective where you now see, oh, well, there actually were other theories supported by that evidence, even though at the time it perhaps seemed that the dominant theory or paradigm was the only one to hold. And then you can draw some conclusion about current theories now, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So using it in that, yeah. So it's sort of using history as a tool. in that way.
Yeah. I think so. Actually, in the Misinformation Age, this book I wrote about false belief, we do quite a bit of that. We draw on a lot of historical cases of false belief to understand false belief now, because of course now we don't know which of our beliefs are false. So you really need this kind of retrospective perspective to look retrospective. Anyway, you need to be able to look back and see, okay, here's why people thought that was true. Here is how they ended up discovering that it was false. Here were all the sociological factors that created that false belief then. And then you can apply it to now to try to think about what, why some of the beliefs we're holding now might be false, which ones might be, what sociological factors now probably contribute to false belief, etc.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we take a little bit of time now, since you've brought it up, to discuss this book, a little bit about the Misinformation Age. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah. So it's a book. It's a trade book, so written for a more popular audience. As I said, it's about false belief, and in particular, it's about the social spread of false belief. So we wrote this book. My co-author is Jim Weatherall, my husband.
Okay.
We wrote this book after the 2016 election. And part of the reason was that at that time, we were both seeing a lot of work on the way individual psychology contributes to reasoning fallacies, basically. So a lot of work on confirmation bias. So that's the bias where you tend to trust evidence that confirms your already held beliefs and distrust evidence that does not confirm your beliefs.
Sure.
And so a lot of people were explaining the kind of current crisis in false belief by appeal to these psychological tics. I've done work in social epistemology and some formal work on modeling science in that area. And we just thought, well, of course, these reasoning biases matter to false belief, but what's much, much more important is understanding social ties and the way we spread beliefs from person to person and the way our social environments shape the things we believe and know and think we know.
Interesting. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So here's a nice way to think about it in a simple manner. If you think about the beliefs you hold, almost all of them are beliefs that were shared with you from another person. So we get almost all of our beliefs from other people. Are tomatoes edible? Well, we think so because our parents gave us tomatoes and said, you can eat these, and we saw other people eating them. We did not go out and discover most things in the world by ourselves, right? So this ability to spread knowledge is, of course, a really important human ability. We would not have culture without it. We couldn't have technology. We couldn't become that's all. We couldn't have culture or technology without it.
Yeah.
But if you think about this as opening a door, you open a door and all of these true beliefs come through the door. Of course, a lot of false ones are going to as well. So you can't have the social spread of knowledge without also having a social spread of false belief.
Could you define, so what do you take to be like true belief and false belief?
Well, so of course there are all sorts of really important philosophical
right. Well, just maybe, yeah.
considerations here. But in the book we take a very pragmatic approach. Basically that, we treat true beliefs as beliefs that are successful in guiding action in the world, and false beliefs that are not going to be able to successfully guide action. So to give a very simple example, the belief that tomatoes are edible. If you believe that, you can successfully act in the world. If you believe tomatoes are poisonous and you're hungry, you can't successfully act in the world, right? So that's just an example, but that's the kind of approach to true and false we're taking here. Just what are beliefs that are going to allow you to effectively interface with the world around you?
Fair enough. All right. And so this is a pretty recent book, though.
Yeah, I think it came out like yesterday officially.
Wow. Okay. Well, this is the perfect time to be talking to you then. All right. Well, what would you like, potential readers to know, or potential, folks who might be reviewing this book? Well, maybe not the reviewers; they'll figure it out. But folks who are interested in clicking over this and be digging into it.
Well, for other philosophers, I think one good thing to know is sort of written in a way that can be taught. So one of our goals here, I think a lot of people at this point are developing courses on related topics. So for example, topics like fake news, understanding misinformation and propaganda. So we talk quite a bit about misinformation in the book as well. How to protect yourself from propagandists, how to hold better beliefs yourselves. So a lot of people are developing courses to educate students about this, which I think is really important. And this book is written in such a way that you can teach it to undergrads.
Yep.
So that's one thing I would like people to know about it.
That's good. So it's definitely keywords: buy the book, order 50 copies, and give it to your undergrad class. Oh, yeah, exactly.
Topically, as I mentioned, it's about the social spread of false belief. Yeah. We use a lot of history of science, as I mentioned, to ground our understanding of why false beliefs spread and when. We also use a number of historical and recent historical political episodes to understand how basically bad interests take advantage of our social ties to control our beliefs. So how did tobacco companies shape our beliefs about the dangers of tobacco? How did various government and industrial actors shape our beliefs about CFCs? How might people be working to keep us from worrying about mercury in fish now? Things like this.
So how do you
Russian propaganda too? We talk about.
Cool. So it sounds like some really cool, I guess, episodes and or case studies that you dig into here. How do you deal with explaining what is and how social forces impact things? How do you define social forces, and how do you go about explaining that?
Right. So we take a couple different perspectives and look at different aspects of the social spread of belief in doing this. So on the most basic level is this thing I mentioned, just when you're spreading belief from person to person, you can get false beliefs that essentially are like a virus or a meme or something that we can all come to believe. So I keep bringing up tomatoes. Europeans thought that tomatoes were poisonous for hundreds of years and grew them because they were pretty but never ate them. And that was a belief that passed from person to person, that tomatoes were poisonous. And you just ended up with this kind of popular misunderstanding of something where you could have this benefit to yourself if you had a correct belief. Then there are other aspects of the way that people spread beliefs that become important. So, for example, there are aspects having to do with social trust. Because we cannot go out and figure out, using science or evidence from the world, what things people tell us are true. So we can't always go out and test everything ourselves. If someone tells me there's dangerous mercury in fish, I can't go catch ocean fish and test it for mercury. We often use heuristics to decide what things we trust. And those heuristics are often grounded in who is telling us something. So, for example, there was a recent study showing that when people were looking at news over social media and saying whether or not they trusted some news item, the source of the news item mattered much less than who shared it. So did they trust their friend who shared it was much more important than did the New York Times write it, for example. One way that we ground trust has to do with shared belief and other shared features as well, social identity features. Yeah. But if you and I tend to share a lot of beliefs, I then also tend to trust what things you tell me. So one thing we discuss in the book is that whenever that's true, you have this very powerful mechanism for polarization. Because if you end up with beliefs that are divergent enough, you also don't trust the evidence that people in another camp are sharing with you.
Sure.
So, for example, if I'm in a group of people who believe that there's mercury in fish and it's dangerous, and there's some other polarized group that doesn't believe that, and I'm gathering evidence about the mercury in fish, and they don't trust me because they don't share my belief, they also can't uptake my evidence because of the way we use these heuristics to ground trust.
Yeah, that's tricky. Is there any solutions to this? Or is this, I mean, I imagine this understanding the problem is just, important enough.
Right. One thing we discuss, which, I mean, all of this is, is not entirely new. We give some new perspectives to it.
Yeah.
But one thing we discuss is that in cases like that, you can use other aspects of shared belief or identity to try to ground trust between people. So, for example, when John McCain says climate change is real, or I guess said climate change is real, that's much more influential on the beliefs of other conservatives than if Barack Obama says climate change is real, because John McCain shares these other beliefs and identity factors with them. Yeah. So that's one way to try to rehabilitate people with false beliefs when this kind of social trust aspect is coming into play.
Sure. Or is it like, or believing that this person, John McCain, who I believe I share similar values with, I'll trust them more. Is that kind of how it?
Yeah.
I was thinking of like celebrities who say things where it's like, I have no idea if I trust their beliefs or we share anything similar, but at least the perception of them is that, or like, I want to, I don't know. Like, why do we campaign for folks to come on the stage and say for the, whatever, the Democratic primary or the Republican primary? And
right. Yeah, this is something that we treat under a slightly different topic, which is reputation, but it's of course connected to this social trust aspect as well.
Sure.
So there are ways in which people have reputations that lead them to be more influential than other people, that lead others to trust them. And I mean, kind of unfortunately, celebrity is such a thing. Like if you're good looking.
Yeah, it's just like people trust. Yeah, you're right. There are these other. Yeah. So, but would those fall under like individual psychology factors, or would those might be slightly different?
Of course, when I sort of pulled apart individual psychology and social factors, but social psychology is very important to determining how social beliefs spread. So, of course, there are psychological factors at play here. They're just psychological factors that have to do with how we uptake knowledge from other people rather than how we reason about bits of evidence that we acquire independently.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the book sounds very interesting, and at such a reasonable price. I'll have to pick up a copy. I've also been interviewing folks where the price is like $80, and I'm like, oh, this is going to be tough. I don't know.
Yeah.
But this is an actual book that I can purchase. So, that's
a nice thing about trade books. Yeah.
Right. They're not. Yeah. It's not like if you're publishing with Oxford or publishing, or I guess, who is this published with?
It's with Yale, but they have both an academic division and a trade division. So it's with their trade division.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. Well, well, best of luck. I hope that it becomes well received. I hope the reviews are good.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned also that you do a little bit of science writing as well.
Yeah. I mean, so I consider this to be connected with that. I haven't done a ton of science writing, but I have written, for Slate and the Huffington Post blog and some places like that.
Yeah. Well, so why did you do that? Why do science writing at all?
Well, it's connected to why we wrote the Misinformation Age as well. I just think it's, if we're doing philosophy, there isn't really a point unless it connects up with people's lives in some way or another.
Are you sure? Are you sure that's right? Because I think a lot of people would. Yeah, no, I hear you.
That connection can be, attenuated. It could be that we're worrying about the Sleeping Beauty problem, and then there's some way in which that influences other people's thought, and then that has some consequence. But I guess I'm not interested in academia unless we're gathering knowledge that's in some way useful or applicable eventually. And so I'm interested in science writing and in general popularizing philosophy because a lot of philosophy actually is useful and can give people important perspectives. And I think, when it comes to false belief, this is exactly such a situation. People have been working in social epistemology and feminist philosophy of science and values in science, discovering all these important things about the way society and our social ties influence our beliefs. And all of this knowledge created by philosophers is quite relevant to our current political and social problems. And so it seems important to me to try to popularize this knowledge, try to bring it to bear on current social issues.
So you kind of mentioned in your teaching of the philosophy of sex, kind of how you educate the general public in terms of philosophy of science. In terms of doing this sort of popularization of philosophy, do you have any advice or could you share some of your experience in how you go about doing that, or how you go about thinking about doing that?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that is hardest for most people and has been a challenge for me is learning how to write and communicate on the right level for people who aren't trained in philosophy.
Sure.
And there's a real essential tension here, which is that to be a really excellent philosopher, you have to put a very fine point on things. You have to think incredibly clearly about very complex, difficult topics. And in order to write in a way that will convey those kind of razor fine points, it's not going to be something that the public or people who aren't trained in philosophy are going to be able to read and connect with. So
sure.
I think, the biggest challenge and the biggest thing I've had to work on is, okay, well, how do I make points that are close enough to being exactly right, that they're, that they improve the kind of epistemic state of my readership and make them in a way that the reader can take up those points and understand what I'm saying and get something out of it. And the same thing with teaching undergrads.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. So any works in the pipeline? Any thoughts on, new articles you'd like to write?
Well, I mentioned to you I have this other book. With Oxford, The Origins of Unfairness, and that I would mention. So that actually,
let's talk about that project.
I wrote that before this book.
Oh, really?
But that's it's an academic monograph, so it took a lot more time and much more blood, sweat, and tears to write. That book uses game theoretic and evolutionary models to look at the origins of basically unfair norms and conventions in human societies. So it's a cultural evolutionary approach to, basically norms where people from one group get more and people from another group get less or hold asymmetric social roles. And one of the biggest points of the book is something like, if you look at this problem from the way patterns of cultural evolution go, using these kind of mathematical approaches, you see that just the dynamics of interaction when people bargain and divide resources are such that when you have social categories, you're almost guaranteed to get inequity. It emerges endogenously really easily. And so if we want to think about intervening on inequitable norms, we have to keep this in mind, that they pop up really easily, and any interventions are going to have to be ongoing interventions. It's not going to be a problem that we can resolve and then be done with. It's a problem that will keep cropping up and will require kind of ever constant vigilance to address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, this sounds a lot. There's a lot going on in this book. I'm reading through the abstract now. Yeah, so when can we expect this book?
This should be coming out. So Oxford just told me it will come out in June.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds really exciting. And are you just kind of working through revisions at the moment, or?
Revisions are all done. It actually was done last June, but of course it takes a while for the production schedule. So proofs have to be made and indexed and figures copied over and all this stuff.
Sure. All right. Well, this looks very exciting, and also a book to be looking forward to. Well, maybe you can catch us up on. So now that this book, you wrote this before, we have this to look forward to. What are you currently up to? I see that you've since 2018 are now associate professor. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Congratulations. How did that go?
Oh, it went great after it was done. I mean, it was like a miserable year of waiting, and then
oh my gosh, yeah.
And then it was very nice to have it over with.
Nice.
Yeah, so I got tenure. I actually wrote another book.
Really? Wow. Okay. Tell us.
But it's a sort of small survey book about game theory and philosophy of biology. So it's very short, and it's for this Cambridge Elements series in philosophy of biology, where it's a bunch of smaller kind of teachable texts. And then now I'm going to just try to do nothing for a while. Nice.
That sounds good. It sounds like some potential time to rest.
Yeah, that's my plan.
So maybe, so for those of us who haven't studied game theory in philosophy of biology, and I know you've mentioned it before in sort of when we discussed the dissertation, maybe I didn't quite ask you about just sort of, what is it about studying game theory that is particularly interesting and relevant for biologists, philosophers of biology, or for anyone who is not super familiar with it but would like to know a little bit more?
Yeah, so game theory is the study of strategic interactions. And by strategic interactions, so people sometimes think, oh, this is about competition or fighting or war, but that's not what game theory is about. It's any interaction where you have multiple agents and where what they do matter to each other, basically. Mm. So any cooperative interaction, any social interaction where something's on the line, bargaining, joint production. So the reason this particular area of math is so relevant to biology and philosophy is that whenever you're dealing with strategic interactions, you can apply game theory. And of course, in biology, evolutionary biology, there are many traits that evolve that are not strategic traits, but much of social behavior is strategic in some way or another. And so game theory has provided a really wonderful tool to think about strategic interactions between animals and humans, of course. And in philosophy, if you think about many traditional problems in philosophy, they also address strategic interactions among humans. So, for example, if we think about language use, language is inherently grounded in strategic interactions. So we communicate because we're engaged in some interaction where we can both benefit by transferring information or by connecting with each other via communication. So we can use game theory to model and better understand that. If we think about, conventional behavior, which is a very old topic in philosophy going back to Hume, conventional behavior is grounded in strategic interactions. We adopt the same conventions so that we can coordinate in our behavior in a way that benefits both of us. So there are just all of these types of human interactions where these formal tools developed in the social sciences can really give philosophers a new way to get at old problems.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe could you what is a potential example of how game theory can resolve an old philosophical problem, or help to, provide more understanding?
Sure. So here's a kind of classical example. So there were these skeptics about natural language, including Quine, who thought, well, we couldn't have established language without having a language to talk about it. So they're sort of skeptical that there could be some natural process by which human language evolved.
Sure. How did it evolve? Yeah.
Yeah. And so philosophers starting with David Lewis and then later Brian Skirms used these very simple games, signaling games, to show actually if you take two actors in a situation where they benefit by transferring information, and where they have extremely simple learning rules, where if something they tried works, they just do it more often the next time, then you get the evolution of conventional meaning, and it's actually really easy to get. So these skeptical worries are just totally allayed by this simple model showing you get basically something that could be as dumb as a pigeon or a snail or a bacteria, and just put them in the right strategic scenario and they can develop a conventional language. So no mystery, basically.
Really? Wow. And so is this, and how do you show that? How do you demonstrate this? I mean, is this demonstrated empirically or through reasoned or through modeling? And then how do you show that like in saying like, and see, this is the language that's shown, and you're like, well, is it language? Is it not? Like, how do you, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, in the particular simple models I'm talking about, you use modeling to show, and it's a kind of proof of possibility modeling. You show,
right.
Take agents who have property X, Y, and Z in situation A, and they are pretty much guaranteed to evolve communication, conventional communication. So you first of all show that this is possible, which Quine did not think it was possible. But as you point out, the model is not the same as the world. And in a signaling game, there are very simple signals. They're not the same as human language.
But it's intentionally not the same, obviously, for the purposes.
Right. And actually a lot of power is gained through this kind of simplicity because you can show how little is needed, basically, to get conventional signaling emerging, conventions that are at least somewhat similar to the kind of conventions we use in our language.
Wow. Very, very interesting. Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense. So language and the signaling it's very big. Is there any work that you're continuing to do yourself with evolutionary game theory?
Yeah, so this project on the evolution of inequity and inequitable norms is an ongoing project. So throughout the project, what I've been doing, and in concert with a number of graduate students and colleagues, is looking, so there's some similarities to the example I just gave with the signaling game. Yeah. We look at these very simple models where we say, suppose we have a group, and suppose the group is divided up into two categories, and these could be men and women, or different racial categories, or different cultural groups, or different religious groups. And suppose that they're bargaining with each other, or dividing resources with each other, or coordinating in a way where someone has to take a dominant role. And suppose they just learn to do what's best for them, that when things they try them again. When someone else does something successful, they copy that successful thing, or they just remember a few of their interactions and do what would be best given their memory. What kind of conventions emerge, and how often are those inequitable conventions, and under what sorts of situations? So we're continuing to explore these models and ask these questions, in part with the intent of understanding inequity and just how pervasive inequity is. If you look around the world, when you have important categories, you pretty much almost always have some level of inequity or normative inequity. But also, how could we intervene on these systems? How can we understand why it's worse in some cases than in other cases, et cetera?
Yeah. Very fascinating. Okay. All right. Well, we'll look forward to some of that work as it comes out. Well, why don't I take this last little bit to ask the final question of the interview, which I've been asking many guests, which is, And sorry I didn't preface this earlier, but what do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
Oh boy. Okay. You mean like what's the biggest problem in our discipline?
I mean, so I think it typically, as respondents have discussed, more methodological or disciplinary type problems, less so in terms of the content problem, like in for example, I don't know, the problem of string, dealing with string theory or something, would be like an example of a content problem, but more so as a discipline, as performing, as doing, as a growing philosophy of science.
Yeah. Okay. To tell the truth, this is so ridiculously Pollyannish, but I feel like we're doing pretty well.
Okay.
I mean, I think that in the time I've been in philosophy of science, I've watched the field really diversify with respect to what kinds of things people are working on. So people have started looking into many new and varied sciences, which I think is really important. Philosophy of science started with just physics, and then finally it was like, oh, there's also biology. But now there's also data science, and there's chemistry and cognitive science and medicine and all of these other areas. And I think this kind of diversity of attention is really creating a lot of nuance and improvement in the theories coming out of philosophy of science. So I've been thinking that the trends I'm seeing are just really good trends. And then also from a more kind of sociology of the discipline perspective, I think the discipline has been diversifying with respect to people too. Yeah. And of course, there's a lot of work to do there. But just in the time I've been in philosophy of science, there are a lot more women, a lot more people of color, more cultural diversity. And I think that's great too. I think we should just keep on.
Okay. This is probably the first very optimistic answer I've received, and so I'm happy. I mean, if we're going to do some comparisons to how things have been, and kind of some of the more positive aspects, I think we have a lot to be proud of, and still a lot of progress to be made, I'm sure.
Yeah. This is the glass half full perspective on those issues.
All right. Well, Cailin, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. Is there, before we go, is there anything else you'd like to mention, discuss, or plug? Anything else you'd like to leave us with some parting words?
Oh goodness. Well, if you are for some reason an undergrad listening to this, you should just apply to the LPS grad program and go on.
I know. I've heard very good things. I actually
think it's a great program.
Yeah.
And we recruit.
You guys were at the PSA this year, right? All right. So
yeah, we were. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
En masse.
Yeah. I think I might have met a few fellows from there. Cool. All right. Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but again, thank you for for spending your morning chatting. I had a lot of fun. It was great to learn about you and your research, and I look forward to the publications of your new works, and best of luck in this spring and the years to come.
Thanks. Can I ask you some questions like off the
off the
thing? So you're a PhD candidate, yeah?
I am. Why don't we?
Yeah.
Why don't we conclude this and then we'll finish that?
Okay.
Okay, one sec. All right. So, it's been a great time chatting, and stay on the line. We'll chat a little bit after.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye, Cailin.